tonight we have a comrade, colleague, and friend, Christoph Hermann, who has led a major project looking at privatization in the EU. And in terms of a bit of background of where Christoph is coming from, he studied political science at the University of Vienna, and he's currently a doctoral candidate at York, working with our friend Greg Elbow. And his doctoral dissertation is concerned with working time. He's employed as a senior researcher at the Working Life Research Center, or in German, Forba, in Vienna. And Forba is partially funded by the Austrian government and has a very close working relationship with the trade union movement in Austria. And for the last 3 years, he's been working on the PEAK project. PEAK is an acronym for Privatization, what is it, Christoph?
Of public services and the impact on quality, employment, and productivity.
Quality, employment, productivity, yeah. It's a long time. But a major research project which only concluded a short time ago and funded to the value of 1.5 million euros. So not a trivial project at all. And if any of you have the opportunity to, it's by and large, I think, available online at the Forba website. And it's a really interesting project, and the conclusions are very relevant to, well, the Canadian, North American context and well beyond, given the moment that we're living through, where public sector work, public services are clearly coming under attack, will continue to be under severe attack going forward as we pay for the biggest bailout of the wealthy in history. In addition to that project, Christoph has contributed to studies in political economy, capital and class, of course, the Socialist Register, a German publication I wouldn't even dare try to pronounce, and
Problems of class struggle.
Problems of class struggle. Okay, well, that's a translation. Okay. And he's presented his research at a large number of academic and trade union conferences. Currently, he's on a sabbatical, lucky guy, and he's a visiting scholar in the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Christoph.
Okay. First of all, let me thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be back in Toronto. I've spent here 2 years studying at York, and it was a very nice time, and I'm always very glad to be here. My presentation will focus on a couple of points. I will first shortly present the PEAK project, which Brian already mentioned. I will then talk about forms of liberalization, privatization, and marketization as we find it in the sectors and countries we covered in our project. The next section then will try to summarize the state of liberalization, privatization, and marketization. Then I'll talk a bit about company reactions to the changes, and that the rest of the presentation will focus on employment, working condition, human resource management, industrial relation, and to the end, this is intended to open the presentation to a broader discussion about trade union strategies and conclusion, what we do or how we interpret these changes. So the project was funded by the European Commission. One impact of that you see on the bottom line of my slides. The European Commission insists that the European sign is on all publications funded by the European Commission. It was a 3-year project. We were at Forba were coordinating the project, and it covered 6 countries, apart from Austria, where I'm from. We had Belgium, Germany, Poland, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Then we focused on 4 sectors. This is partly reflected through the call by the Commission. So the Commission wanted that we cover a broad range of sectors. In our case, electricity and postal services as network industry, local public transport, health services with a special focus on hospitals as municipal services. The research included, many parts over the three-year duration of the project. Among them, literature and data analysis, especially in terms of employment and productivity development. Then we made a series of company case studies in the different sectors and companies. There, that's also probably interesting for a Canadian project that tries will investigate the impact of liberalization and privatization. There we went into the companies and did interviews with management, trade union representative, work council representative, and a number of workers. So for each case study, we did something like 12 interviews. And that was a very important part of the project because it allowed us to understand the dynamics induced by the changes. The last part of the project was a representative surveys on users' perspective, classical telephone interviews. Here you have the 6 partners, or 7, because in one country we have 2 institutes from the same university. And so I'll start with talking about the forms of liberalization and privatization and marketization we find in Europe and in the sectors and countries we were covering in the project. The first major form is the abolishment of monopolies, or what is usually called the liberalization of public services. As you know, or probably the same situation like here in Canada, public providers in electricity or postal services enjoyed a monopoly until a couple of years ago, actually. So there was only one supplier in a territorial defined area. But we have seen this form of change we see primarily in the network industry, and from our sample, especially in electricity and postal services. In both sectors, the process was driven by European directives that literally forced member states to open the markets to competing providers. As we stand now, we have in the electricity sector, we have fully liberalized the whole EU member states, which means that consumers in principle should be able to choose between 2 and more providers. This is the case since 2007. In the post sector, there was a full liberalization was planned for 2011, but had to be postponed. No, it was planned for 2009, but had to be postponed to 2011, and for some countries to 2013, because of resistance of some member states, including, most notable, France. The second form of change that we find in our country and sector sample is what is commonly known as competitive tendering. Here, it is not the providers competing for customers, it's providers competing for exclusive but temporarily limited contracts. This form of liberalization and marketization we find particularly frequently in the transport sector, local public transport, and all all transport routes that are subsidized, and that's by far the majority of transport routes, have to be tendered according to a EU regulation, with the exception, and this is important for cities. Cities can still operate their integrated transport services if they meet a number of obligations. This was necessary. The EU or the Commission also wanted them to force to adapt competitive tendering, but the cities were too strong, so the whole project was risking to fail. Therefore, this compromise. Another important change in the sectors that we have is a change in funding. What we see here as a tendency is a move away from full cost funding to what could be called output-related funding. This has the important consequence that providers can make losses or profits. This form of change from our sectors is particularly strong or particularly present in the hospital sector. So what we see across Europe is a shift, what is called DRG, diagnosis-related systems payments, or which is a form of flat rate payments for medical procedures in hospital, rather than a coverage according to the days a patient has spent in the hospital, which was the case before. This has then creates all kinds of pressures in the hospitals. Another tendency which exists in virtually all sectors is a conversion from public companies, public law companies, into private law companies or public limited companies. This is not only the case in the network industries, but increasingly also in municipal services, transport companies, even if they are municipal transport companies, are converted into public private law companies. And this is also quite remarkable. Many hospitals, hospitals in Europe nowadays take the form of a private law company. The exception here is Britain, where they have a special status as trust or foundation trust. But this status is in fact very similar to that of a private company. Another important trend is what we perhaps associate most with privatization is the broad and full divestment of public assets in company. But we have a full scale of different degrees in that spectrum. So we have companies that are fully privatized companies where the state still holds a minority share, companies where the state still holds a majority share. Last but not least, there are also other forms of marketization that are important in again, all four sectors. This is outsourcing, private-public partnerships, and what is called private finance initiative. Outsourcing, again, in literally all sectors. Just one example, Deutsche Post or German Post has deployed about 1,600 subcontractors in 2005, according to a report from the German post regulators, including taxi drivers who empty letterboxes. In the hospitals, we see a move towards outsourcing, initially concerning mainly so-called secondary services or soft services, such as cleaning, laundry, and catering. Then, in a second step, more sophisticated services such as IT were outsourced, and what we have now is increasingly an outsourcing of medical procedures. So let me summarize what is the state of these developments in the four sectors we looked at. As I mentioned, in the electricity industry, we have full liberalization since 2007, meaning that consumers can choose their providers. What we have as a result of this liberalization, however, is not so much strong competition, or strong competition probably only in some market segments. What we see is increasingly oligopolistic market and a strong increase in private ownership. We also see, we didn't look at prices in the peak project, but of course what we also see in the electricity sector is a constant increase in prices, but it's difficult to say how much this is due to liberalization or to generally increasing energy prices. There are, however, studies that show that it has something to do with liberalization. In the postal services, as I mentioned before, full liberalization is scheduled for 2011 and 2013. From the countries we covered in our project, however, Germany and the United Kingdom and Sweden already have fully liberalized postal market. What we see so far is that we still have a dominant position of the former monopolist or incumbents, and again a substantial increase in private ownership. In local public transport, the situation is more diverse across the countries, also because there's not the EU regulation is not so is not so strong as in the other two sectors. What we have is largely liberalized local public transport sectors in Sweden and the United Kingdom. But, for example, also on the level of local railways in Germany. So local railway lines in Germany are also increasingly tendered. As a result of this development, we see an increase of providers. Then, when after some years, kicks in a concentration process, and in the end, it's substantial concentration and combined with an increased role of international transport companies. Hospital sectors, already mentioned, a common trend is a conversion into private law companies, changes in funding to the DRG system. What we have here, which is quite remarkable, we have a wave of hospital privatizations in Germany. In Germany now, 30% of all hospitals are private for-profit hospitals, because Germany has public, private, not-for-profit and private hospital. And the proportion is now higher than in the United States, and the proportion doubled since 1991. And we also have what is a remarkable development. Initially, the private sector mainly focused on small hospitals, where with not relatively standardized procedures, but they have more recently they have bought up big hospitals, as for example the municipal hospitals in Hamburg, city of Hamburg, with more than 5,000 beds. And they also privatized a university hospital in Gießen-Marburg. So there's some very it's not interesting. It's actually frightening developments going on there. What we have on the other hand is a kind of special situation in the United Kingdom, where in England all hospitals in the since 1997 were built on new hospitals were built on a PFI scheme, which means that the hospital were built by a private company partner and financed by a private company partner, and then leased back by the hospital for usually a period of 30 years. This has then important consequences for the hospital, how the hospital operates, because as we increasingly see, the costs for these PFI schemes are much higher than if the money would have been borrowed by the state. And so what the hospitals get into a situation where they have cut costs, including cutting hospital beds to pay back to meet their PFI payment obligations. Generally, over the sectors, what we see as a result of the changes is what could be described as more privatization really than liberalization, in the sense of intense competition. This does not mean that we have intense competition in some market segments. We tried to capture that in this overview, which is probably already outdated. I think the important thing to remember is what we have as a result, especially in the network industry, is a replacement of public monopolies with private oligopolies. That seems to be the common tendency, which does not mean that because they are private oligopoly, they increase the pressure on their workforce. So the next point I would like to talk about is the question how the companies responded to the situation of more markets, more competition in the four sectors. What we see as a first reaction, and this is of course linked to this, the creation of the oligopolies, we see a tendency of mergers and acquisition. This is particularly widespread in the electricity industry. From the case studies we looked at, these were 6 case studies. There was only 1 case study which was not involved in a merger and acquisition in the last 10 years. Overall, for the electricity sector, we see now in Europe that we have 5 to 7 companies that dominate the European electricity market. In postal services, it's still a bit different here. As I mentioned before, we still have the national players dominating, but we see the same tendencies as, for example, a merger between the Danish and the Swedish Post, both from a national monopolist, formed what is now called Nordic Post. On a much more smaller case, we even have mergers in the hospital sectors, local hospitals being merged to regional hospital chains. A second tendency that we find as a result of the changes is an increase in private and foreign ownership. Private ownership I already mentioned, but in many cases this is not only private ownership but also foreign ownership. Again, the electricity case studies, except for 1 case studies, all 6 electricity companies, these were not the leading but probably mid-range players in Europe, were owned by foreign capital. In Belgium, for example, the whole electricity industry in Belgium is now foreign-owned. And the same tendency we have particularly strongly, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, where Western European companies go in and buy up the existing electricity and other public services infrastructures. A third major tendency we see as a result is a tendency of internationalization. The reason for that is that as former monopoly providers, the companies can only lose market shares in their home countries. So to either make up for the losses or further increase their revenues, they have to go abroad. One of the case studies we looked at and that in this case German Post prides itself as the world's leading post and logistics companies and now operates in 220 countries. It has almost 500,000 employees, the majority of which is employed outside Germany, and also the major part from its revenues now comes from outside Germany. For the same reason, we see a tendency of diversification, so electricity companies start to invest in waste management and gas supply, postal companies in transport and logistics. And at the same time, we have a focus on lucrative market segments. This is again particularly the case in postal services, where we have especially the new competitors who arrive on the market. They are not interested in creating a universal post service for the country. All they are interested in focusing in on the one hand urban centers, on the other hand big business clients, which make up the large part of the business. So just to give you an idea, the households make up for less than 10% of the turnover of the post companies. So that's the big money where they're going, and this has, as I'll show you, also consequences for the employment and working conditions. We also see the introduction of what could be called profit-oriented price policy. With this, I mean that as a result of the liberalization, the large companies can now negotiate about price policy. So the big companies would negotiate with German Post, Amazon, for example, negotiate with German Post special price discounts, whereas small companies and households still pay standard prices, and in many cases the standard prices have increased after liberalization. As one manager told us in one of the interviews, somebody has to pay for it. So if they, yeah, I mean, if they give discounts to the large companies, somebody has to make up for it. As a last major trend, which I will now follow up and talking a bit more about, is a general tendency, general response to cost cutting, and this is independently if the companies are facing intense competition or not. They are, all of them start cutting costs, no matter if they are forced to do by competition or forced by their shareholders. So if you look at cost cutting, again, we can identify a number of major trends, how companies are trying to lower their costs. First tendency is reorganization and introduction of new technology. Introduction of new technology is actually quite important and probably one of the few positive effects of liberalization. We in our case study, based on our case studies, we have to admit that reorganization, of course I will show you the next slide, especially in terms of outsourcing, creation of subsidiaries, and other measures. A second tendency is what I would call streamlining of supply. This we have, for example, particularly prevalent in the post sector, where post companies have started to close post offices and concentrate their services. In Germany, for example, since the start of the liberalization process, 40% of the post offices are gone. The same number, we can find the same number in Austria. At the same time, another tendency, which I'll come back in more detail, is the reduction of employment, payment of lower wages, casualization and dequalification of work, and intensification of work. So here's the example of reorganization. What used to be a regular municipal transport, so in a German city has been turned to almost a myriad of independent subsidiaries with cross-shareholding. The important thing to remember, though, is that all these three levels of they operate bus, and the city mobile provides bus and rail services, and the other three only bus services. The important thing to remember is that all three companies have different collective agreements. The conditions provided by the collective agreements get worse and worse the lower end on this outsourced chain. One of the broader theme of this presentation: what is the impact, especially on employment? What we find here is, first of all, substantial reductions of employment in electricity and postal services. There, the employment has fallen by, depending on the case study, by between -34% and -9% in electricity. -9% is Poland, where the changes are still ongoing. The same in postal services, between -20% in Sweden and -8% in Belgium. These numbers are confirmed for the electricity sector by studies by the European Commission. Meanwhile, post sector, the European Commission still assumes a lower number, but this is because they include Eastern Europe, where Central Eastern Europe, where the liberalization process in the post sector is only about to pick up speed or accelerate. It is also important to remind that the European Commission, in its initial documents on its liberalization project, has promised increasing employment as a result of liberalization. And green paper or white paper on services of public interest, they still say that liberalization in postal services and electricity will create more jobs. It's completely, they have proved wrong on that, and they now admit it. That's one thing they admit. But we also see, we not only see a reduction of employment, we see at the same time an increase in atypical and precarious employment, such as, for example, part-time and marginal part-time. Part-time and marginal part-time we see in particular in the post sector, connected to the reorganization of the delivery routes. I'll show you some numbers of Germany in the next slide. But generally, post sector in Europe, in many countries, becomes a part-time sector. The whole delivery system will be converted into part-time work. But we see also see temporary jobs. This development we find in particular in the electricity industry. In Belgium, for example, about a quarter of the workers in the electricity industry are employed on temporary contracts. We see an increase in fixed-term contracts. That we see again in local public transport, and this is connected to the tendering system. So the employment contracts are adjusted to the duration of the contract won by the contractor. I don't know, 8 years probably, something like that. And last but not least, we also see an increase in self-employment, and that we see, for example, in the postal services in Austria, where I'm from. The new competitors on the lettermarks in Austria operate with 90% of their deliverers are self-employed. And they are not only, they are self-employed, they are paid piece rates, and most of them, because they earn so low wages, are either commuters who come from nearby Slovakia or the Czech Republic to Vienna. That's about an hour, 2 hour drive to work in Vienna and then go back. Or they are asylum seekers with an unsecure resident status, so they cannot find another job. Here is the situation in the German letter markets. As you can see, German Post still operates with 60% full-time employees and about 33% part-time workers, and a very small still comparable small number of workers on marginal part-time or mini jobs. But if you look at the competitors in the letter market, they operate with more than 80% part-time, and the majority, 60%, is a marginal part-time. Marginal part-time means that you have a monthly salary of less than 400 euros, and the employers use marginal part-time because they don't have to pay social security contribution. So it makes for them, it makes the workers much cheaper. Here is a comparison of wages in the post sector in Austria, Germany, and here I also include Netherlands, which we covered in an article on the post sector. As you can see, the new competitors pay about half of their hourly wages of the established of the workforce of the incumbents, and I'll explain in the next slide what this incumbent old and incumbent new means. Again, you have to keep in mind that in Austria and Netherlands, the same situation as in Austria. These are hourly wages of self-employed workers, no social security, and that are averages calculated on piece rates. A problem here is that needs to be mentioned is that the monopolists apply the same strategy in other countries. So you have German Post, who complains about the low wages of competitors in Germany, does the same thing with its subsidiary in the Netherlands. The Dutch Post, the same thing. The Dutch Post, the subsidiary of the Dutch Post in Germany still refuses to pay the post minimum sector wage. And also, what's an interesting development in Austria and Netherlands, we have the situation that the incumbents have set up their own low-cost subsidiaries. So in Austria and in the Netherlands, they themselves have operated a subsidiary which pays these wages, and this has then important consequences when it comes to increasing pressure on their own workforces to accept wage cuts. This is what we see here. First, in the postal sector, for example, we now have in Austria, that this is a very recent development since August. We have a new collective agreement for newly hired workers. That's only for newly hired workers, which provides up to 25% less salary than for the old workers. And the union accepted this after the management had threatened to outsource the complete delivery network to its low-cost competitors, where it pays wages for to its low-cost subsidiary, where it pays wages of between 5 and 6 euro. In Germany, we had this development much earlier. Lower wages for blue-collar workers and white-collar workers since 2001, 2003, up to minus 30%. And the German Post is now putting pressure on Verdi to accept further cuts, for even go further down, because they argue that even this is 30% lower, it's still clearly higher than the wages paid by the competitors. In the electricity industry, we have similar developments. In Austria, for example, minus 30% in the case study we looked at since 2001.
In Belgium, between 22 and 34% less since 2002. Germany, the biggest supplier there, pays 30% less than before since 2006. We only have a very interesting situation in the electricity industry in Poland, where the case study company we looked at paid higher wages for new employees. That might have changed with the crisis, but before it was that the older staff couldn't leave the company because they wouldn't, if they leave the companies, they would remain unemployment until they are retired. Whereas it became increasingly, the labor markets became tight for skilled younger workers because many of them went to Western Europe. So the company did not increase the collective wages. They remained flat, but offered new employees, younger employees, higher wages to join the company. If we look at working conditions, again, several trends that we found in the case studies. As a general trend, an increase in work intensity and work pressures. This is on the interviews with management. Management doesn't deny that. They don't deny that. They just say it's justified. There was too much slack before. Just to give you a notion, in the Austrian case, an average postman that delivers mail in Austria now delivers mail to twice as much delivery times than 10 years ago. We also see increasing work pressures in the hospital. There we see it in the staff-to-patient ratios. If you look at the staff-to-patient ratios, we see, for example, that in private hospitals, they have a much lower staff-to-patient ratios, 10% lower or 10% higher is actually that, right? We're 10% higher for doctors and about 20% higher for nurses. As I mentioned earlier, we also have similar developments. These numbers are for Germany. We have also similar developments in the UK in connection with this PFI construction. Because companies, hospitals have to save costs, they increase pressure on their workforce and intensify workforce. And a common result of these changes is what we also saw and found in the interviews, growing frustration among public sector workers, both in the postal sector and in the hospital sector. Increase in weekly working hours that we found, for example, in the transport sector in Germany. Increase in part-time hours, I already mentioned, for the post sector. Post sector, in large part, will become a part-time industry in the delivery. We have an increase in overtime. That again we find in electricity, in connection with the massive cuts of employment of staff numbers there, and in the transport, local public transport, an increase in split work days. Just a couple of remarks to changes in human resource management, or what this means for human resource management. On a very general level, the public sector employment or public service employment, and for that matter, seems to become more of a temporary job instead of a lifelong employment career as it used to be. That tendency we find almost in all sectors. Just to give you one example, the new competitor in Sweden in the post sector has a labor turnover of 100% per year. So the staff on average, mostly young people who do that besides studying or some other thing, they remain there for a year. But so that becomes, in that sense, the public sector becomes increasingly like the private sector. We see also an introduction of performance-related wage components through all sectors. weakening of seniority and poor performance, and introduction of performance-based promotion, differential access to training, especially training opportunities for skilled young workers, less training for older workers, and in some sectors in countries we even see tendency of dequalification. That we see, for example, in the post sector, where that the profession of delivery is dequalified because the deliverers do not. Previously, it was the case that they do the final sorting of the mail on the local post office or on a local distribution base. This work has increasingly been relocated to largely centralized, highly automated sorting facilities. So what remains from the job is the mere delivery of mail, and because they increasingly use GPS devices, the deliverers don't even have to know the neighborhood anymore. So they are sent out with the GPS device to deliver mail. This, of course, has the consequence that mail is increasingly delivered on the wrong address. That's true. That's you find and that's what we find in our user survey. But the deliverers, and that's people who do it as a second job delivery, and in the Netherlands, for example, the collective agreement for the former monopolist in the Netherlands differentiates between a regular postman and the postbote, what they call postbote in Dutch, and that's somebody who only delivers mail and there's no sorting anymore, and that was the lower wage I showed you before. Because as all the background is introducing new wage categories to do lower wages. Dequalification we also saw in the British electricity industry, which had a fairly developed training system before privatization, and this was one of the first things the new private owners eliminated. Interestingly, the case study company we were looking at, they now have problems with skilled workers and have restarted an apprenticeship program, but of course on a much lower scale than it used to be. Just to sum it up, what does this mean for industrial relations? What we see is a growing fragmentation and the emergence of two and multiple tier labor relation systems. As mentioned before, we see differences between old and new employees, differences between incumbents and new competitors, and differences between parent companies, subsidiaries, and outsourced services. This amounts to what we think can be described as the dismantling of the public sector labor relations regime. The public sector labor relations regime was characterized by high union density, centralized bargaining, high bargaining coverage, an employment status that with a high level of security, so civil servants and public employees, and what's important, relatively homogeneous workforce, high employment security, and low competitions on wages and working conditions. And these, all these characteristics are changing. And what we still have, though, is a different situation in the former monopolists, where part of the former system is maintained, but increasingly reduced, and the new system, especially within the new competitors that have company bargaining or no bargaining, low bargaining coverage, the unions have problems to get a foot in there, and high wage differences. I would like to end to say something about what we have seen so far as trade union responsibles to these changes in Europe on a very, of course, very schematic level. But generally, I think what we first saw when governments proposed liberalization and privatization, we saw an initial phase of rejection and opposition. But in most cases, or at least I'm not aware, that this phase also included waves of strikes. Unions were not able to stop the development. So what then followed was a second phase, what could be probably described as concession bargaining. Here, primarily on early retirement and golden handshakes, the massive job losses I talked about earlier. Most of them happened without compulsory layoffs. They found ways to reduce workforce, not really on a voluntary basis, but without forced layoffs. As mentioned before, this phase also includes the protection of the rights of the established workforce, but concessions for new entrants. New employees earn less, have less employment security, etc. What then followed probably can be described as a third phase. What we see in some sectors at least are attempts to build broader anti-privatization alliances with social movements and initiate anti-privatization referenda. This is probably, some of you may know, for example, Keep Our NHS Public in the UK, or for that it's similar to the Ontario Health Coalition. The movement really started off in this regard after the struggle against the European Service Directive, which was adopted, but, for example, as a success of this struggle, healthcare was taken out of the directive. We have seen a number of anti-privatization referenda on the local level. In Germany, for example, in Hamburg, one against the privatization of water, another one against the privatization of hospital. In both cases, there was a majority vote against privatization. In the case of hospital, this didn't keep the major from selling the hospitals anyway. But still, it's. I think there is some interesting developments there. At the same time, we found still struggled to resist further restructuring of the companies. So not prevent liberalization anymore. That's from the table. But for example, in the case of Austria, the postal workers are struggling to keep the post offices open because they know if they are closed, they're going to lose again workplaces. At the same time, bargaining and lobbying for social regulations in the sectors to counteract these huge wage disparities. Here, for example, can be mentioned the struggle for a minimum wage in the German post sector, which was adopted but suspended because it was tried on the court, and the High Court decision is still pending. What can be described as a fourth phase in this struggle, which has only started recently, is that trade unions have begun to promote alternatives to integrate, move services back into the public realm. EPSU, the European Public Service Union, for example, has started a campaign on that issue, and this amounts what in Germany is described as remunicipalization. So not only fighting liberalization, privatization, and the consequences, but starting a struggle on the public sector, rebuilding the public sector in some sense. This also involved some initiatives on the European level for the adoption of a European Public Service Directive, which however failed. Okay, so now the conclusions. I guess my first point is to acknowledge that the commodification of public services demands for the commodification of public sector employment. And that is the changes because the widespread changes we have seen over the last 10 to 20 years. So the commodification of services is connected to the commodification of employment. Another development which is important to keep in mind is that commodification of public sector employment of course means wage cut, casualization, intensification, as I tried to outline in the presentation. This all amounts to growing inequality, but what is important, it's not only really growing inequality among workers, but also growing inequality among public service users. As I mentioned, big business, large customers win, small customers lose, people in the urban centers win, people on the rural areas lose. So I think we can interpret this whole project privatization as a class project. And what is interestingly, in this regard, one of the things we found out in our survey is that if you ask people on their attitude towards privatization or liberalization, the most defining factor is income. So low-income people are against privatization, high-income earners are pro-privatization. That's much more telling than which country, which sector, and all other possible indicators. We should also keep in mind that especially if we want to build these alliances between unions and social movements, that these changes amount to a deterioration of service quality, especially in those areas where the quality depends on high labor, large amounts of labor inputs, such as, for example, the hospitals, and decent working conditions. There is no other way to increase profits than to deteriorate employment and working conditions. Commodification is an ongoing process. As I mentioned before, the unions are still struggling against restructuring. Postal Workers Union, the Austrian one, certainly thought they were done with this whole process 5 years ago. They thought, yep, they made the concession, this thing is done. And it keeps coming back to that. That's seems to be a general development in the sector. So I also I'm deeply convinced that the financial crisis will not lead to a stop of this development. It may lead to a stop when it comes to the big privatizations of Royal Mail, for example, in Britain, which is now put on a hold, or Deutsche Bahn in Germany, because they are not the financial markets, there are not enough private capital and willing to invest in these operations. But it will come back big time through outsourcing, private-public partnerships, and private financial initiative. And this will be, again, put a special challenge, a specific challenge for unions, because it's difficult to explain to people what's going on because they cannot see it. You will not notice if you board a bus that the bus is no longer run by your municipal transport company, but by an international transport multinational. So there's a lot of there's going to be a lot of work needs to be done in this respect. Pressure on public sector trade unions and workers will further increase as a result of this development. Services will most likely further deteriorate. The more important it is to build these coalitions between trade unions, social movements, users, and also what's important. I'm not I'm not familiar in this regard about the situation in Canada, but for Europe certainly, one of the major challenges is to unionize the new competitors. I mean, some of union, like Verdi in Germany, made a lot of efforts in the past, but it will be of critical importance to also organize these new workers in the sectors. Okay, that's from my side. This is our web address, www.peak.at. Here you can find all the reports to download, or you can email me for further question or more information.
Bravo, thank you.